June 6, 1944, Normandy Beach. A Sherman tank named Fury takes a direct hit. The crew abandons it. The mission is over, except one man refuses to leave. Sergeant Curtis Cullen had no engineering degree, no special training, just a crazy idea involving scrap metal and a welding torch. His commanding officer called him insane. But what he built in 48 hours would change the entire invasion. One broken tank, one mad mechanic, and an invention so simple, so brilliant, that Eisenhower himself ordered 5,000 copies made. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how a sergeant with a blowtorch saved D-Day. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone. The Hedgerow Nightmare, Normandy, France. June 1944, 6 days after D-Day, and the Allied advance had ground to a complete halt. Not because of German tanks, not because of artillery, but because of hedgerows. These weren't the decorative hedges you might have in your backyard. Norman hedgerows were ancient barriers, thick walls of earth, stone, and tangled roots that farmers had built over centuries to mark property boundaries. Some were 15 feet tall and just as thick. The roots went down 10 feet or more. They were natural fortresses, and they covered Normandy like a maze. For American tank crews, these hedgerows became death traps. Every time a Sherman tank tried to climb over a hedgerow, its thin belly armor would be exposed, the most vulnerable part of the entire vehicle. German soldiers positioned on the other side with anti-tank weapons would simply wait. The moment a Sherman's underside appeared, they'd fire. One shot, one kill. Over and over again, Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron watched this nightmare unfold daily. He'd see tanks approach a hedgerow, tilt up as they tried to climb, and then erupt in flames. The crews rarely survived. Those who did were traumatized, burned, or both. The medics were overwhelmed. The morgue details worked overtime. The tactical situation was desperate. Allied planners had expected to be 30 miles inland by now, pushing toward Paris. Instead, they were stuck in a dense network of hedgerows, advancing only a few hundred yards per day. Every field was a separate battle. Every hedgerow was a new problem. The Germans didn't need massive reinforcements. They just needed to wait behind these natural barriers and pick off American armor as it exposed itself. The mechanics inside Cullen was not an engineer. He had no college education. Before the war, he'd been a mechanic in New Jersey, fixing cars and trucks. But he understood machines. He understood leverage and force. And as he watched yet another Sherman burn after trying to climb a hedgerow, something clicked in his mind. The problem wasn't the hedgerows themselves. The problem was that tanks were trying to go over them instead of through them. If you could somehow cut through the hedgerow at ground level, plow through it rather than climb it, the tank would never expose its vulnerable belly armor. The Germans couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. But how do you cut through 10 feet of compacted earth, stone, and roots? These hedgerows had withstood centuries of weather. They weren't going to yield to anything short of massive force applied in exactly the right way. Cullen started sketching ideas in a notebook he always carried. His crewmates thought he was crazy. "Cullen's at it again," they'd joke. "He's going to solve the whole war with his little drawings." They meant it affectionately, but there was an edge to it. A lot of smart people had looked at the hedge problem. None had solved it. What made one sergeant think he could do better? Cullen ignored the skepticism. He'd learned long ago that people underestimated mechanics. They assumed that because you worked with your hands, you didn't work with your mind. But every good mechanic was a problem solver. Every repair was a puzzle. You learned to see how things worked, how forces interacted, how to make stubborn machinery do what it was supposed to do. The hedgerows were just another kind of stubborn machinery. They had to be persuaded, that's all. And Cullen thought he knew how. He just needed a broken tank, some scrap metal, and permission from an officer crazy enough to let him try. The mad proposal Sergeant Cullen approached his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, with a proposal that sounded insane. He wanted to take a damaged Sherman tank, one that had been hit but was still mobile, and weld steel prongs to its front. These prongs, made from German anti-tank obstacles called Czech hedgehogs, scattered all over the Normandy beaches, would act like giant knives. The tank would ram into hedgerows at full speed, and the prongs would dig in and rip through the earth and roots, creating a path. Captain Morrison stared at Cullen like he'd lost his mind. "Let me understand this, Sergeant. You want to take a tank that's already been shot at, Weld scrap metal to it and then deliberately drive it full speed into a solid earthen wall. That's your plan? Yes, sir, Cullen replied calmly. The current plan is to drive tanks over hedgerows where they get shot in the belly. My plan keeps the armor facing the enemy at all times. The Germans can't penetrate frontal armor. They need the belly shot. If we never give them that shot, they can't kill the tank. Morrison was silent for a long moment. The logic was sound, but it was still crazy. Welding modifications to tanks in a combat zone, using untested equipment in battle. If it failed, good tanks and crews would be lost. If it worked, they might actually start making progress. How long would it take to build this thing? Morrison asked. Give me 2 days, some welding equipment, and permission to scavenge metal from the beach obstacles. I'll have a prototype ready. Morrison made a decision that would change the course of the Normandy campaign. You have 48 hours. If this doesn't work, we're both going to be explaining ourselves to some very angry generals. Building the beast, Cullen saluted and got to work immediately. He requisitioned an acetylene torch, welding equipment, and a work crew. Then he headed to the beaches where the initial D-Day landings had taken place. Those beaches were now littered with German defensive obstacles, the very obstacles that were supposed to stop Allied landing craft, but had been largely bypassed in the initial assault. The Czech hedgehogs were perfect for Cullen's purpose. These were steel anti-tank obstacles made of 3 heavy iron beams welded together in the shape of a giant jack, like a massive children's toy, but made of hardened steel and weighing hundreds of pounds. The Germans had planted thousands of them on the beaches thinking they'd stop tanks and landing craft. Instead, they'd become scrap metal waiting to be repurposed. Cullen and his crew cut the hedgehogs apart with torches. Working through the night, they trimmed the steel beams to the right length, about 4 feet long. They sharpened the tips. They reinforced the welds. By the end of the first day, they had 4 prongs ready, each one thick as a man's leg and hard as railroad track. The next phase was more delicate. They had to weld these prongs to the front of a Sherman tank, without compromising the tank's structural integrity or interfering with its movement. Cullen calculated angles and positions carefully. The prongs had to be low enough to dig into the base of the hedge, spaced wide enough to rip through a broad section, and strong enough to withstand the impact without snapping off. You really think this will work? Asked Private Eddie Kowalski, one of the welders helping with the project. I know it'll work, Cullen replied, adjusting his welding mask. The physics are solid. Steel teeth driven by 30 tons of tank hitting earth and roots. Something's got to give, and it won't be the steel. By dawn on the second day, the modification was complete. The Sherman tank now had 4 steel prongs extending from its front, like the tusks of some mechanical beast. Soldiers gathered to look at the strange creation. Some were impressed, others were skeptical. More than a few took bets on whether Cullen would be court-martialed or commended. Looks like a pig trying to mate with a porcupine. One soldier joked. Cullen patted the steel prong affectionately. Maybe so. But this pig's about to root through every hedgerow between here and Berlin. Captain Morrison walked around the modified tank, examining the welds, testing the strength of the prongs. Finally, he nodded. All right, Sergeant, you've built your mad contraption. Now you need to prove it works. Tomorrow morning we're going to find a nice thick hedgerow and see if this thing is genius or suicide. That night, Cullen couldn't sleep. He ran through the calculations in his head over and over. The math worked. The engineering was sound. But there was a difference between theory and reality. What if the prongs snapped on impact? What if they dug in too deep and the tank got stuck? What if the whole crazy contraption just made things worse? But he thought about those burning Shermans, those crews who never made it out. He thought about how the hedgerows were turning Normandy into a graveyard for American armor. Something had to change. And if his idea worked, it could save hundreds of lives. Tomorrow would tell. The test of genius. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Cullen's modified Sherman rolled toward a particularly thick hedge that had been selected for the test. It was a beast of a barrier, 12 feet high, ancient, impenetrable looking. Several officers had gathered to watch, including Captain Morrison and Major Jack Williams from Division Headquarters. The Sherman's crew had volunteered for the test. Driver Corporal Jake Mitchell, Gunner Sergeant Tom Harrison, and Loader Private First Class Danny Chen. They were either brave or crazy, possibly both. As they buttoned up the hatches and the engine rumbled to life, the gathered soldiers fell silent. Cullen stood with the observers, his heart pounding. Everything he'd calculated, everything he'd built, came down to the next 60 seconds. If it worked, they'd revolutionize the Normandy campaign. If it failed catastrophically, good men might die and he'd be the one who killed them. "Ready?" Morrison asked, looking at Cullen. "As I'll ever be, sir." Morrison raised his arm, then dropped it, the signal to proceed. The Sherman's engine roared louder. Black smoke belched from its exhaust. Then, with gathering speed, it charged directly at the hedge. 30 tons of steel accelerating toward an immovable object. The impact was thunderous. The entire tank shuddered. Earth exploded outward. Roots snapped with sounds like rifle shots. For a moment, the tank seemed to stall, embedded in the hedge mass. Soldiers held their breath. Then slowly at first, the Sherman began to move forward. The steel prongs were working. They were digging deep into the ancient earthwork, creating leverage ripping through roots and stone. The tank tilted forward slightly, not exposing its belly but maintaining a nose-down attitude that kept frontal armor facing any potential threat. More roots snapped. Dirt cascaded off the tank's hull. The engine screamed with effort. And then suddenly the Sherman burst through the other side of the hedgerow, emerging into the field beyond. The tank had created a perfect breach, wide enough for other vehicles to follow, low enough that the tank's vulnerable underside had never been exposed. The soldiers erupted in cheers. Cullen felt his knees go weak with relief. It had worked. His crazy idea had actually worked. The Sherman's crew popped their hatches and emerged, grinning. "That was the smoothest hedgerow crossing I've ever experienced," Corporal Mitchell shouted. "We barely felt the impact inside, and we never once exposed our belly to enemy fire." Major Williams approached Cullen, his expression serious. "Sergeant, how many of these modifications can you produce? And how quickly?" "Sir, if I get enough welders and access to more hedgehog obstacles, my crew could modify 10 tanks a day. Maybe more if we really push it." "Not good enough," Williams said, and Cullen's heart sank. Then the major smiled. "I'm going to get you 50 welders and all the steel you need. I want 100 tanks modified by the end of the week, and I'm sending a report to General Bradley immediately. This invention is going to change everything." Captain Morrison clapped Cullen on the back. "Congratulations, Sergeant. You're no longer the mad mechanic. You're the genius mechanic who just saved the Normandy campaign. The real test, combat." But Cullen wasn't celebrating yet. "Sir, with respect, one successful test doesn't mean it'll work in combat. We need to try this against an actual German position with real enemy fire. That's the only way to know if it's truly effective." Morrison nodded grimly. "I thought you might say that. There's a German strongpoint about 2 miles from here. They've been holding up our advance for 3 days. Battalion wants it taken, but every approach is blocked by hedgerows, and every attempt to cross those hedges has been suicide. If your modification works there under fire, it'll prove your concept beyond any doubt." "When do we go, sir?" "Tomorrow at dawn. I'm assigning you to the tank as technical advisor. You'll ride with Mitchell's crew. If there are problems, you need to be there to see them and understand why." Cullen swallowed hard. He'd been hoping to stay back and just build more modifications. But Morrison was right. He needed to see his invention in actual combat. Only then would he know if the design needed improvements. Only then could he honestly say it was ready for mass production. "Understood, sir. I'll be ready." That night, Cullen checked and rechecked every weld on the modified Sherman. He tightened bolts. He examined the prongs for any stress fractures from the test. Everything looked solid, but combat was different from a controlled test. In battle, nothing went according to plan. Private Chen found him working late by lantern light. "Sergeant, you should get some rest. Big day tomorrow." "Can't sleep, Chen. Too much thinking." "You scared?" Cullen considered lying, then decided honesty was better. "Terrified. This thing works in theory. It worked in one test. But tomorrow, people's lives depend on whether I got the math right. If I made a mistake somewhere, if there's a design flaw I didn't see, then we trust you saw everything," Chen said simply. "You built this thing. You know it better than anyone. And tomorrow, we're going to plow through those hedges and show the Germans they can't hide anymore." Cullen wished he had Chen's confidence, but all he could do was prepare as best he could and hope that his mad idea was actually genius. Tomorrow would be the real test. Rhinoceros in battle dawn broke over Normandy with a cold drizzle that made everything gray and miserable. Cullen climbed into the Sherman tank, taking position in the commander's cupola, where he could observe and give technical advice to the crew. His stomach churned with nervous energy. The plan was straightforward. Their tank, now nicknamed Rhinoceros by the crew, would lead a small column toward the German strongpoint. They'd use the hedgerow cutter to breach barriers that had previously stopped all advances. Infantry would follow close behind, using the breaches to advance without being caught in the killing zones the Germans had established. "Mount up," came the order. Engines rumbled to life across the staging area. The Rhinoceros shuddered and began rolling forward, its steel prongs gleaming wetly in the dawn light. They approached the first hedgerow. Beyond it, according to intelligence, was a German machine gun nest that had been mowing down American infantry for days. The usual tactic would be to try climbing over the hedgerow, exposing the tank's belly to a German Panzerfaust, a handheld anti-tank weapon that could punch through weak armor like paper. "Steady," Cullen said over the intercom. "Hit it at a slight angle, about 20 degrees. That'll help the prongs bite in." "Roger that," Corporal Mitchell replied, adjusting their approach. The impact came with a bone-jarring crash. Earth and roots exploded around them. Inside the tank, the crew was thrown forward against their restraints, but nothing broke. The prongs held. The tank pushed forward, engines screaming, tracks churning, ripping through centuries-old growth, and then they were through, emerging on the other side to find a shocked German machine gun crew scrambling for their weapon. The Sherman's main gun spoke first. One high-explosive round that eliminated the threat before the Germans could react. "It works," Chen shouted over the intercom. "It actually works in combat." But there was no time to celebrate. More hedges lay ahead, and behind each one could be enemy troops. The Rhinoceros continued its advance, breaching hedgerow after hedgerow. Each time the prongs performed perfectly. Each time the tank emerged before the Germans could bring anti-tank weapons to bear. The infantry following behind the Rhinoceros were ecstatic. For the first time since D-Day, they could advance without being pinned down by hedgerow defenses. They poured through the breaches the tank created, clearing German positions that had seemed impregnable just hours before. Then came the real test. Intelligence had warned them about a German Panther tank, a far more dangerous opponent than infantry, positioned behind a particularly massive hedgerow. The Panther's 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at long range. If the Rhinoceros got stuck breaching the hedge, they'd be a sitting duck. "Contact front," Harrison called out. Panther partial cover behind the hedge. Cullen's mind raced. They could retreat, call for artillery, play it safe. But that's what the old tactics would have been. The whole point of his invention was to change the rules. "Breach the hedge," Cullen ordered. "Don't stop for anything. We go through fast. We emerge with our gun already aimed where that Panther is. Speed is our advantage." Mitchell didn't hesitate. The Sherman surged forward. The impact was massive. This hedge was thicker than any they'd hit yet. For a terrifying moment, the tank seemed to slow, the prongs struggling against the dense mass. "More power," Cullen shouted. "Give it everything." The engine howled. Smoke poured from the exhausts. The tracks threw up huge clouds of earth, and inch by inch the Rhinoceros forced its way through. They burst through the hedgerow at an angle. Not perfect, but good enough. Harrison had kept his gun trained on where the Panther should be, and as they emerged, there it was, its turret still turning to track their unexpected appearance. Harrison fired first. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's side armor, thinner than its frontal armor, and penetrated. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its hatches. Its crew bailed out, and the Rhinoceros's machine guns persuaded them to surrender rather than fight. The infantry caught up, securing the German prisoners. An officer approached the Rhinoceros, grinning broadly. "Sergeant Cullen, I don't know what kind of witchcraft you worked on this tank, but you just did in 2 hours what we've been trying to do for 3 days. That German strongpoint is finished." Cullen climbed out of the tank, his legs shaky. He'd done it. The design worked not just in a controlled test, but in actual combat against real enemy positions under fire. His mad idea had proven itself. Captain Morrison arrived shortly after, his radio crackling with reports from other units. "Sergeant, I just got word from Division. General Bradley himself wants to see you. Apparently, Major Williams' report made quite an impression. They're calling your invention the Cullen hedgerow cutter, and they want 5,000 of them manufactured immediately." 5,000? Cullen could barely process the number. His little modification, built in 48 hours from scrap metal, was going to be mass-produced and deployed across the entire Allied armored force. Sir, I'm just a mechanic. I'm not sure I should be. You're the man who solved the hedge problem, Morrison interrupted. Own it, Sergeant. You just changed the war. Mass production and recognition. Within days of the Rhinoceros's combat success, every tank depot in Normandy received orders to begin installing Cullen hedgerow cutters. The Army brought in welding teams from engineering battalions. They scavenged more Czech hedgehogs from the beaches. They set up assembly lines in fields, working around the clock. Cullen found himself pulled from his unit and assigned to train welding crews. He went from depot to depot, showing them the exact angles for the prongs, the proper welding techniques, the reinforcement methods that would keep the cutters from snapping off under stress. The key, he'd explained to each new group of welders, is that the prongs have to dig in low. If they're too high, the tank tilts up and exposes its belly. Too low and they just plow dirt without cutting roots. You want them positioned exactly here. He'd mark the spot with chalk at a 15-degree downward angle. That gives you optimal cutting action. Some welders were skeptical at first. The design looked crude, just steel prongs stuck on a tank. But when they saw combat footage of rhinoceros tanks plowing through hedges that had stopped everything else, skepticism turned to enthusiasm. They worked faster, taking pride in the modifications they were installing. General Omar Bradley visited one of the tank modification sites personally. He found Cullen elbow-deep in a welding project training a new crew. Sergeant Cullen, I presume. Cullen snapped to attention, recognizing the stars on Bradley's collar. Yes, sir. At ease, Sergeant. I came to see the man who unstuck my army. Bradley smiled. Your invention is brilliant in its simplicity. We've been throwing sophisticated engineering solutions at the hedgerow problem for weeks. Artillery barrages, explosive charges, modified dozers. Nothing worked consistently. And then you come along with scrap metal and a welding torch and solve it in 2 days. Sir, I just did what needed doing, Bradley finished. That's what good soldiers do. I'm recommending you for the Legion of Merit, and I'm also authorizing a field promotion to technical sergeant. This army needs more men who can think outside the box. After Bradley left, Cullen's crewmates mobbed him with congratulations. But Cullen felt conflicted. He was being lauded as a genius, receiving medals and promotions. But men were still dying in Normandy. His invention was helping, but it wasn't magic. The war was far from over. Private Kowalski, who'd helped with the original prototype, pulled him aside. You okay, Sarge? You don't seem too excited about all this. I am, Eddie. I keep thinking about all the crews we lost before this invention. What if I'd thought of it sooner? What if I'd pushed harder to get it tested? You can't think like that, Kowalski said firmly. You can't save the guys who died before, but you're saving the guys who are still alive. Every day, more tanks with your cutters are rolling through hedgerows. Every day, fewer crews are burning. That's what matters. Cullen knew Kowalski was right, but the guilt still gnawed at him. In the quiet moments, he'd think about the tank crews who died trying to climb hedges in those first weeks after D-Day. If only he'd worked faster. If only he'd been more insistent. If only. But war didn't give you time for if only. It demanded that you keep moving forward, keep solving problems, keep trying to save whoever you could save today. Evolution and adaptations, as the Cullen hedgerow cutters saw widespread use. Soldiers in the field began reporting back with suggestions and modifications. The cutter worked brilliantly, but there was always room for improvement. Some crews found that adding a fifth prong in the center improved cutting performance on particularly thick hedgerows. Others experimented with serrated edges on the prongs, which helped them grip and tear through stubborn root masses. A few creative tank commanders added reinforcement plates to protect the welds from enemy small arms fire. Cullen embraced all these modifications. He'd never claimed his design was perfect, just that it worked. If soldiers in the field could make it work better, he wanted to learn from them. The best ideas come from the guys actually using the equipment, he explained to a visiting war correspondent. I came up with the basic concept, but dozens of tank crews have contributed improvements. This isn't just my invention anymore. It belongs to every soldier who's made it better. One particularly clever modification came from a tank crew in the 3rd Armored Division. They'd noticed that the cutters sometimes got clogged with packed earth and roots, reducing their effectiveness on subsequent hedgerows. They added a simple mechanism, inspired by agricultural harrow equipment, that automatically cleared debris from the prongs as the tank moved. It was a small change, but it meant tanks could breach multiple hedgerows in succession without stopping to manually clear the cutters. Cullen immediately incorporated this improvement into his training for new installations. "See, that's genius right there," he'd tell welding crews. "I never thought about debris clearance. Some tanker in the field saw the problem and fixed it. That's how good engineering happens, iteratively with input from the people actually using the product." German confusion and countermeasures. The German response to the hedgerow cutters was interesting. At first they seemed baffled by the sudden Allied ability to breach hedgerows. German after-action reports captured later in the war showed confusion. Enemy armor is now passing through hedgerows without exposing vulnerable areas. Unknown how this is being accomplished. Once they figured out what was happening, the Germans tried various countermeasures. They attempted to reinforce hedgerows with hidden mines. They positioned anti-tank guns at angles where they might catch breaching tanks. They even tried creating fake hedgerows as traps with pre-positioned anti-tank weapons waiting for attacking tanks. But none of these countermeasures consistently worked. The fundamental problem remained. The Cullen cutter allowed tanks to breach hedgerows while keeping their thick frontal armor facing the enemy. As long as Allied tank crews used proper tactics, the Germans couldn't effectively counter the new capability. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began the race across France, the hedge cutters had become standard equipment. New Sherman tanks rolling off production lines in the United States were being manufactured with cutter attachment points already welded in place. The field modification had become an official part of tank design. Cullen had literally changed how tanks were built. Unexpected applications as Allied forces pushed beyond Normandy into the more open terrain of inland France. The hedge cutters saw less use for their original purpose, but tankers quickly discovered that the cutters had other applications that nobody had anticipated. In urban warfare, the steel prongs proved excellent for smashing through brick walls and wooden barricades. Tank crews used them to breach buildings where German snipers had taken position. The psychological effect was devastating. The sound of a 30-ton tank crashing through a wall was enough to convince many German defenders to surrender rather than fight. During river crossings, crews found that cutters provided additional traction when tanks had to climb muddy riverbanks. The prongs dug into slippery soil, preventing tanks from sliding backward at critical moments. In winter warfare, cutters helped push through snowdrifts that would have otherwise bogged down vehicles. They acted like massive snowplows, clearing paths for following troops and vehicles. Cullen, now a master sergeant and attached to an engineering evaluation team, traveled to different units to study these creative applications. He took extensive notes, sketched modifications, and recommended design improvements based on field observations. "I never imagined my hedge cutters would be used for all this," he wrote in a letter home. "I just wanted to get through Norman hedgerows, but soldiers are creative. They'll use any tool for whatever purpose serves them. My cutters have become multi-purpose battlefield tools." The most unexpected application came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German forces, launching their last major offensive, had created extensive roadblocks using felled trees to slow Allied counterattacks. Tank crews discovered that hedgerow cutters could push aside or break through these tree obstacles, allowing armored columns to maintain momentum even when roads were blocked. One after-action report described a Sherman crew using their Cullen cutter to literally push a disabled German tank out of a narrow road, clearing the way for an entire American column to advance. The cutter prongs hooked under the German tank's skirt armor, the report read, and with some effort our Sherman was able to shove the obstacle aside. This unconventional use of the hedgerow cutter prevented a multi-hour delay that could have compromised our tactical objectives. Cullen found that story particularly amusing. "I built a tool to cut through bushes," he'd say, "and now they're using it to move disabled panzers. War makes you creative, I guess. Limitations and legacy, but not all the news was positive. Some tanks suffered equipment failures when cutters were used beyond their design specifications. Prongs snapped off when tanks tried to push through reinforced concrete obstacles. Welds failed when crews used cutters to try to lift heavy objects. There were even cases of friendly fire incidents when other units didn't recognize modified tanks in poor visibility and mistook the prong silhouette for enemy equipment." Cullen worked with Army engineers to develop better training materials. The cutter is a tool, not magic, he emphasized in training sessions. It has limitations. Use it wrong and you'll break it or get someone killed. Use it right and it'll save your life and complete your mission. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the hedgerow cutter had become such standard equipment that new tankers barely remembered a time when Shermans didn't have them. The innovation had become normalized, integrated into doctrine and tactics. For Cullen, this was both gratifying and slightly melancholy. His invention had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But success meant that people forgot it had ever been a problem. The hedgerow cutters were just there, part of the tank. Unremarkable. That's how you know something really worked, Captain Morrison told him. When people can't imagine it ever being different. You didn't just solve a problem, Cullen. You made the problem disappear so completely that nobody even remembers it existed. Not everything about the hedgerow cutter's success story was positive. There were costs and consequences that Cullen hadn't fully anticipated. The first cost was human. When tanks gained the ability to breach hedges rapidly, infantry commanders began using armor more aggressively. Some attacks that might have been delayed or canceled in the pre-cutter era were now launched with the expectation that tanks could overcome hedgerow obstacles. This led to some units being pushed into situations where they took casualties that better caution might have prevented. Cullen wrestled with this guilt. Did I give commanders a tool that made them overconfident? He wondered aloud to Chaplain Thomas O'Brien during a rare moment of reflection. You gave them a tool that saved lives, O'Brien replied gently. What commanders chose to do with that tool, the tactical decisions they made, that's on them, not you. You can't control how people use what you create. You can only try to create things that do more good than